Trapped in the sinking car, 8 months pregnant, she watched her husband save his mistress and leave her to die. But she survived. And when she returned home pretending to remember nothing, she began to build the perfect revenge. If you enjoy stories like this, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. The storm was crashing down on the Pacific Coast Highway like an impenetrable curtain of water and fury. Eleanor Vance gripped the steering wheel of the Mercedes with trembling hands, feeling the weight of her 8-month pregnancy, pressing against the seatbelt. Beside her, Richard, her husband of 6 years, was checking his phone with that distant expression she had learned to hate. In the back seat, Jessica Sampson, supposedly Eleanor's best friend since college, pretended to be asleep, but Eleanor could feel the tension radiating from her like an invisible frequency. The evening had started so differently. The charity dinner at the Beverly Hills Hotel had been a success, another occasion for the Vance family to display their power and influence in the Los Angeles business scene. Eleanor, heiress to Vance Industries, a conglomerate that controlled everything, from construction companies to hotel chains, had given a moving speech about motherhood and legacy. Richard had applauded politely, but his eyes hadn't met hers once all night. And Jessica, always Jessica, was there with her perfect smile and sugar-coated words, offering to ride back home with them since her apartment was on the way. The car skidded dangerously as Eleanor tried to navigate a curve. She knew this road like the back of her hand, had driven this route thousands of times since childhood, but the rain had transformed the familiar into something menacing and treacherous. Richard finally put down his phone, his hands gripping the dashboard as a truck appeared in the oncoming lane, its blinding lights cutting through the darkness like blades. Eleanor swerved the wheel sharply, the sound of screeching tires mixed with the screams echoing inside the car. It all happened in slow motion and yet too fast to process. The Mercedes broke through the guardrail as if it were made of paper, and then came the seconds of free fall, the moment suspended in the air, where Eleanor felt her baby kick violently in her womb, as if the child knew something terrible was about to happen. The impact with the water was brutal. Eleanor felt the air being forced from her lungs, the seatbelt cutting into her round belly, the explosive pain radiating throughout her body. The water began to pour in immediately, cold as ice, rising up her feet, ankles, knees. Panic paralyzed her for a precious instant. She tried to unbuckle the belt, but her hands were shaking too much, her fingers, swollen from pregnancy, refusing to obey her brain's desperate commands. That's when she saw it. Richard had managed to free himself. He was free. Eleanor reached out to him, her lips forming his name in a silent plea, but Richard didn't look at her. His eyes, those brown eyes that had once promised eternal love, were fixed on the back seat. Jessica was screaming, her hands pounding against the window as the water rose faster back there. And Richard, her husband, the father of her unborn child, stretched to reach the other woman. Eleanor watched, mesmerized by the horror, as Richard freed Jessica from her seatbelt. She saw him break the rear window with an emergency hammer that was supposed to be stored next to the driver's seat. Next to her. She saw him grab Jessica by the shoulders, preparing to push her out. And for a fraction of a second, Richard looked back. His eyes met Eleanor's, and in that gaze was something she had never imagined seeing there. It wasn't love, not even pity. It was calculation. It was a choice. It was abandonment. The water was already up to her chest when Richard pushed Jessica out and disappeared after her, leaving Eleanor alone in the car that was rapidly sinking into the ocean. The taste of blood mixed with salt water filled her mouth. Her hands kept fighting the jammed seatbelt, but it was useless. The metal was stuck, warped by the impact. Eleanor felt tears burning her eyes, not from fear for her own life, but from an anger so deep it felt like it was burning inside her like acid. Her baby kicked again, harder this time, and something inside Eleanor broke. It wouldn't end like this. She would not die here, abandoned and betrayed. Her child would not die before even knowing the world because of a man's cowardice and a false friend's betrayal. With a strength that seemed to come from some primal, fierce place, Eleanor fumbled through the submerged wreckage. Her fingers found a sharp piece of glass. She gripped it, feeling it cut into her palm, and began to saw at the seatbelt with savage determination. Every second was an eternity. The water was already covering her face, forcing her to tilt her head back to steal desperate gulps of air. Her lungs burned. Her vision began to darken at the edges, but she kept soaring, until finally the belt gave way. Eleanor pushed herself upward with her last reserves of energy, swimming toward the surface that seemed infinitely distant. Her body, heavy with pregnancy, fought against the water, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. When her head broke the surface, Eleanor choked, gasping for air in great, painful gulps. The rain was still falling in a torrent, but to her, it was like a blessing. She was alive. They were alive. She and her baby had survived. On the shore, just 20 yards away, Eleanor could see the silhouettes of Richard and Jessica. He was holding her in his arms, and even through the curtain of rain, Eleanor could see the intimacy of that embrace. It wasn't the embrace of a savior and a victim. It was the embrace of lovers. Eleanor swam toward the rocky shore, each movement an agony. When she finally managed to drag herself out of the water, collapsing to her knees in the mud, she saw Richard finally notice her presence. He let go of Jessica as if she were on fire, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment, no one moved. The three of them stood frozen in that tableau of betrayal and survival. Richard was the first to recover. He ran toward Eleanor, his face a mask of concern that would have been convincing if she hadn't seen what she had seen. His hands tried to reach for her, but Eleanor recoiled, instinctively protecting her womb. The red and blue lights of an ambulance cut through the darkness in the distance. Someone must have seen the accident and called for help. Eleanor felt a wave of dizziness wash over her, her body finally succumbing to the trauma and extreme effort. Before the darkness completely swallowed her, Eleanor made a choice that would change everything. She looked at Richard, then at Jessica, who remained a few feet away, shivering, and wet, and decided. She would say nothing, not now. She would hold what she saw, what she knew, like a weapon to be used at the right moment. Revenge, Eleanor realized as consciousness slipped away, didn't have to be hot and impetuous. It could be cold, calculated, and absolutely devastating. When the paramedics arrived, they found a pregnant woman on the verge of collapse, a desperate-looking man holding her hand and crying, and another woman in a state of shock. To all appearances, it looked like the scene of a tragic accident, where everyone had fought to survive. No, one suspected that Eleanor, even semi-conscious, was already planning every move of the game that was about to begin. A game where she would be the only one holding the rules, and where Richard and Jessica would discover that underestimating a betrayed woman and a mother protecting her child was the most fatal mistake they could ever make. The ambulance cut through the rainy Los Angeles night, its sirens echoing through the canyons like a harbinger of what was to come. The hospital smell was oppressive, that characteristic mixture of disinfectant and pain that seemed to permeate every surface of Westwood General Hospital. Eleanor woke up slowly, her consciousness emerging in layers. First came the pain, a dull, persistent ache radiating from her abdomen. Then came the sounds, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, distant voices in the hallway, the low hum of the air conditioning. Finally, the memory. She remembered everything. The icy water, the jammed seatbelt, Richard turning to save Jessica first. The clarity of that memory was like a sharp blade cutting through the fog of painkillers. Eleanor kept her eyes closed for a few more moments, needing that time to reorganize her thoughts, to build the persona she would need to wear from now on. When she finally opened her eyes, she found Richard sitting by the bed, his head bowed as if in prayer. He looked exhausted, with deep, dark circles under his eyes and an unshaven face. When he realized she was awake, his face lit up with a relief that Eleanor knew was at least partially genuine. After all, if she had died in the water, the questions would have been inevitable. Her survival, as much as it complicated his plans, also protected him. "Eleanor, the doctor said you were so lucky," Richard began, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You and the baby. It was a miracle. The doctor said they'll need to induce labor in a few days, just to make sure Gabriel doesn't suffer any delayed effects from the trauma." Eleanor noted that he had already chosen the name they had discussed, using it as if it were a joint decision. Gabriel. The name meant messenger of God. How ironic. Richard took her hand, and Eleanor allowed it, watching every micro-expression on his face. He was testing her, she realized, trying to gauge how much she remembered. Eleanor let her eyes remain, vacant, confused. "I don't really understand what happened," she murmured, making her voice tremble slightly. "It was all so fast. The rain, the truck, and then the water. I remember the water." She saw the relief wash over Richard's face like a wave. He took a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing imperceptibly. "It's normal to have fragmented memories after a trauma like that," he said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "The important thing is that you're safe now. We're all safe." The mention of "we're all" confirmed what Eleanor suspected. Jessica was still around. The room door opened, and Jessica herself walked in, carrying an excessively large bouquet of white roses. She was wearing new, expensive clothes, definitely not the wet, ruined evening gown from the night before. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She looked like someone who had spent the night at a spa, not someone who had nearly drowned. "Eleanor, darling," Jessica said, placing the flowers in a vase already overflowing with arrangements. Her voice was all honey and concern, but her eyes, when they briefly met Richard's, told another story. "I was so worried. I couldn't sleep all night thinking about you and the baby." Eleanor forced a weak smile. "It's so good to have real friends at times like this," she said softly, and saw Jessica blink rapidly, as if something sharp had pricked her conscience. The next few days unfolded in a carefully orchestrated routine. Labor was induced, and Gabriel was born crying vigorously, a healthy 7.5-pound baby who seemed completely indifferent to the drama that had surrounded his arrival into the world. When they placed the baby in Eleanor's arms for the first time, she felt something solidify within her, a determination that went beyond anger or the desire for revenge. It was a promise. She would protect this boy with everything she had, and no one, especially not his father, would steal his future. Richard held Gabriel with a tenderness that might have fooled Eleanor at another time, but she now saw the little things she had previously ignored, the way his eyes constantly darted to his phone, the whispered calls he made in the hallway, Jessica's frequent visits, always with excuses about wanting to help, about being the baby's godmother, about being there for her best friend. It was during one of these visits that Eleanor pretended to be asleep and overheard the conversation that confirmed her worst suspicions. "She needs to sign the papers soon," Jessica was saying, her voice low but urgent. "The longer we wait, the riskier it gets." Richard muttered something Eleanor couldn't catch, but the tone was one of agreement. Then Jessica continued, "After she signs over management of the companies to you, we can start phase 2. The clinic we talked about accepts patients with postpartum trauma. No one would question it if she needed some time in a place like that." Eleanor had to bite the inside of her cheek hard to keep from reacting. They wanted to declare her incompetent. They wanted to lock her up in some kind of psychiatric institution while Richard took control of the Vance empire. And then, presumably, she would just be an inconvenient obstacle to be disposed of one way or another. The plan had a cruel simplicity that Eleanor could almost admire if it weren't directed at her. Her hospital discharge came a week after Gabriel's birth. Eleanor left the hospital in a wheelchair, standard protocol, with her son in her arms and Richard by her side, smiling for the cameras. The news of the accident and Gabriel's miraculous birth had spread through social media, and reporters were waiting outside. Eleanor used it to her advantage, letting them photograph her looking fragile and shaken, holding her baby as if he were the only solid thing in a crumbling world. The return to the Vance family mansion in Bel Air was suffocating. The house, a magnificent colonial-style estate that had been in the family for 3 generations, felt different now. The shadows seemed darker, the hallways longer. Every room held secrets that Eleanor was beginning to unravel. Richard insisted she stay in the master bedroom, saying it would be better for her to be close to him in case she needed help during the night. Eleanor agreed meekly, but she knew it was just so he could monitor her more closely. Jessica naturally moved in too. Richard presented the idea as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "She can help with the baby while you recover," he said during dinner on the first night. "You know how hard these first few weeks are, and Jessica has nothing tying her down now that she's left her job." Eleanor knew Jessica had never had a real job, living off inheritance money and generous boyfriends, but she just smiled and thanked him for his consideration. The following weeks were a delicate and dangerous dance. Eleanor played the part of the traumatized and slightly unstable new mother perfectly. She would intentionally drop plates, forget conversations she'd just had, cry for no apparent reason. Each episode was carefully calculated to seem authentic, but not serious enough to warrant immediate institutionalization. She needed them to feel confident, to believe their plan was working. Meanwhile, Eleanor began her own investigation. In the dead of night, when Richard was sleeping, soundly after the whiskey she graciously served him every evening, Eleanor searched his office. She found newly opened life insurance policies with obscene values. She found power of attorney documents he had tried to get her to sign, claiming they were just postpartum formalities. She found text message exchanges between him and Jessica that dated back almost 2 years, long before the accident. This wasn't a recent affair. It was a long-term conspiracy. Eleanor photographed everything with a secondary phone she had bought secretly, using cash she had gradually withdrawn from her purse. Each piece of evidence was sent to an email account only she knew, then deleted from the device. She was building a case piece by piece, brick by brick, but she needed more. She needed something definitive, irrefutable. The opportunity came from an unexpected source. The family's housekeeper, Mrs. Peterson, who had worked at the house since Eleanor was a child, approached her one afternoon while Richard and Jessica were out. The older woman was visibly trembling as she handed Eleanor an envelope. "I don't know if I should be doing this, Miss Eleanor," she said in her shaky voice, "but I've looked after you since you were a baby. I can't stay quiet and watch what's happening in this house." Inside the envelope was a key and a piece of paper with an address. "It's an apartment," Mrs. Peterson explained. "Mr. Richard has kept it for over a year. I found out when I took one of his suits to the dry cleaner, and the key fell out of the pocket. I followed him once just to be sure. He meets Miss Jessica there, regularly." Eleanor held the key as if it were made of gold. This was exactly the kind of evidence she needed. A love nest maintained for so long proved premeditation, showed that the betrayal was deep and planned. With this and all the other evidence she had collected, she could not only defend herself, but counterattack with devastating force. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson," Eleanor said softly, kissing the older woman's forehead. "You have always been loyal to our family. I will never forget this." That night, Eleanor lay beside Richard, listening to his breathing become deep and regular. Gabriel slept in his crib next to the bed, oblivious to the storms gathering around him. Eleanor stared at the ceiling, her brain working in overdrive. She had proof of the affair. She had evidence of the financial manipulations. She had witnesses. She had documents. She had everything she needed to completely destroy Richard and Jessica. But when would she strike? That was the question that kept her awake. If she acted too soon, they might have time to regroup, to create counter-narratives, to use the resources they still had access to. If she waited too long, she might give them the opportunity to execute their plans. The timing had to be perfect. She needed to wait for the moment when they were most confident, most exposed, most vulnerable. Eleanor lifted Gabriel from his crib, holding the sleeping baby against her chest. His little heart beat against hers, a constant reminder of what was at stake. "It's okay, my love," she whispered in the dark. "Mommy's going to fix everything, I promise." She looked back at the sleeping Richard, unaware that the woman beside him was no longer the naive, loving wife he thought he could manipulate. She was something far more dangerous. She was a mother protecting her child, and a woman who had decided she would no longer be anyone's victim, ever again. Gabriel's christening was scheduled for 3 months after his birth, enough time for Eleanor to appear to have recovered enough to organize a social event, yet still maintain that aura of fragility that Richard and Jessica so appreciated. The ceremony would be held at the Church of Our Lady of the Coast, followed by a reception at the mansion for 200 guests. It was exactly the kind of event Richard wanted, an opportunity to showcase his growing position at the helm of Vance Industries. What Richard didn't know was that Eleanor was using the christening as the stage for the first act of her own play. In the 3 months since she had returned from the hospital, she had done much more than just collect evidence. She had begun to move strategic pieces on the board with a patience and precision that would have surprised anyone who only knew her as the spoiled heiress of the Vance family. First, Eleanor had discreetly contacted the family lawyer, Mr. Howard Sterling, a man who had served her father for 30 years and held an ironclad loyalty to the original family. The meetings took place in quiet cafes in Santa Monica, always when Richard thought she was at postpartum checkups or taking Gabriel to the pediatrician. She showed Mr. Sterling all the evidence she had collected, every document, every photograph, every message. The older man turned pale when he saw the extent of the conspiracy against his client. With Mr. Sterling's guidance, Eleanor began to restructure the Vance empire in a way that Richard didn't even notice. Each change was small, seemingly technical, the kind of bureaucratic adjustment that happens constantly in large corporations. But together, these changes wove a web that slowly transferred all real power back to Eleanor, leaving Richard with only empty titles and illusory authority. The delicious irony was that Richard signed every document without reading it. So confident was he that Eleanor was too incompetent to understand the family business. He believed he was manipulating her, getting her to sign powers of attorney and transfers that benefited him. What he didn't realize was that every paper he signed, thinking he was consolidating his power, was actually weakening it further. During this time, Eleanor also began to work on another crucial aspect of her plan, the relationship between Richard and Jessica. She needed them to become careless, arrogant, overconfident, so she began to plant subtle seeds of discord, like a gardener cultivating weeds. A casual comment here about how tired Richard seemed from his responsibilities, an observation there about how much money Jessica was spending on clothes and jewelry. Little insinuations that made each of them question the other's motives. The tension in the house grew like pressure in a cooker. Jessica, who had initially moved through the mansion as if she owned it, began to notice that her position was less secure than she thought. Richard, in turn, became increasingly irritated with her demands for more money, more attention, more guarantees about their future together. Eleanor watched it all with the quiet satisfaction of a chess master seeing her plan unfold. One night, 2 weeks before the christening, the tension finally boiled over. Eleanor feigned sleep as she heard Richard and Jessica arguing heatedly in the hallway. "You promised that as soon as you took full control, you'd get rid of her," Jessica hissed, her voice laced with venom. "It's been months. That pathetic woman is still here, still married to you, still has control over everything." Richard tried to calm her, but his own voice was strained. "You need to be patient. If we move too fast, people will get suspicious. We've already gotten her to sign most of the papers we need. It's just a matter of time." Jessica wasn't convinced. "I can't stand pretending to be her friend anymore. I can't stand seeing her with that baby, living the life that should be mine. You promised, Richard. You promised we'd be together for real." Richard's response was too low for Eleanor to hear, but it must have been satisfactory because the argument ended with sounds Eleanor preferred not to identify. She clenched, her fists under the sheets, reminding herself that anger was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. The revenge, when it finally came, would be all the sweeter for having been waited for. The day of the christening dawned glorious, with a perfect blue sky and a gentle breeze coming off Santa Monica Bay. Eleanor had chosen her dress carefully, a light blue model that made her look delicate and maternal, but with a cut that showed she had regained her figure. Gabriel was adorable in his white christening outfit, oblivious to the drama that would unfold around him. The church ceremony went off without a hitch. The priest spoke of family, faith, and legacy, words that sounded almost comical given the context. Jessica was there, of course, in a dress that Eleanor noted was excessively revealing for a church. Guests whispered, but Richard seemed not to notice or care. He held Gabriel during parts of the ceremony, playing the role of the proud father with an expertise that would have earned him an acting award. The reception at the mansion was even more elaborate. There was a giant white tent in the garden, tables decorated with flower arrangements that cost a fortune, a buffet catered by the best restaurant in LA, and a jazz band playing softly. The 200 guests included the crème de la crème of Los Angeles society, business leaders, politicians, celebrities, all circulated with glasses of champagne, congratulating Eleanor and Richard and admiring Gabriel. Eleanor moved through the party with a fixed smile, accepting congratulations and well wishes, but her eyes were always watchful. She saw Richard talking with business partners, selling himself as the new visionary leader of Vance Industries. She saw Jessica in a corner, drinking more champagne than she should, her gaze following Richard with a possessive intensity that was beginning to draw attention. It was almost time. When the right moment came, Eleanor knew it instantly. Richard stepped onto the small stage set up for speeches, taking the microphone with the confidence of someone who believed he had already won. He began to talk about family, about legacy, about how honored he was to take on more responsibilities at Vance Industries so that Eleanor could focus on being a mother. The words were beautiful, but Eleanor could see the naked ambition behind them. He was using his own son's christening as a platform for his final coup. Eleanor didn't wait for him to finish. She simply walked up to the stage, Gabriel in her arms, and held out her hand for the microphone. Richard, surprised, handed it to her, thinking she would just add a few sweet words to his speech. What happened next made his blood run cold. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate my son's christening," Eleanor began, her voice clear and strong, without a trace of the fragility she had been displaying for months. "This is truly a moment for new beginnings. Gabriel represents the future, and I want to ensure it's a future built on truth and integrity." She paused, letting the silence grow, all eyes fixed on her. "That's why I want to announce some important changes at Vance Industries." Richard took a step forward, but Eleanor stopped him with a look. "First," she continued, "as you all know, I went through a traumatic experience a few months ago. Some of you may have thought that this left me fragile, unable to manage my family's business." She looked directly at Richard, then at Jessica. "But the truth is, trauma can make us stronger, clearer, more determined." Eleanor handed Gabriel to Mrs. Peterson, who had appeared beside the stage as planned. With her hands free, she gestured to an assistant who brought up a tablet. On a large screen, she projected documents for all the guests to see. "During my recovery, I worked with our lawyers to completely restructure Vance Industries. All companies, properties, and investments have been placed into an irrevocable trust in Gabriel's name." She let that sink in for a moment. "I will be the sole trustee of this trust until Gabriel turns 25. The murmur that swept through the crowd was like low thunder. Richard was pale, his hands visibly shaking. Eleanor continued, relentless. "This means that all powers of attorney, transfers of power, and authorizations signed in the last few months are null and void. Vance Industries remains under the control of the Vance family, and the Vance family alone." She smiled, but it was a smile without warmth. "After all, we must protect Gabriel's legacy from anyone who might have interests that are not in his best interest." Richard finally found his voice. "Eleanor, that's not how it works. That's not what we discussed." But Eleanor was already stepping down from the stage, taking Gabriel back from Mrs. Peterson's arms. "Actually, Richard, that's exactly how it works. You'll find all the documents are perfectly legal. Mr. Sterling can confirm." She gestured to the lawyer, who was among the guests, nodding gravely. "Now, let's enjoy the party. It is my son's christening, after all." The party continued, but the atmosphere had completely changed. Guests whispered among themselves, processing what they had just witnessed. Some looked at Richard with pity, others with ill-disguised contempt. Jessica had disappeared, likely having realized her house of cards had just collapsed. Richard remained in place for a long moment, staring at Eleanor as if he were seeing her for the first time. And perhaps he was, because the woman he had underestimated, betrayed, and abandoned to save his mistress was no longer the Eleanor he had known. This Eleanor was a force of nature, and he had just found that out far too late. Eleanor held Gabriel closer, kissing the baby's forehead as she watched Richard leave the party with stiff, clumsy steps. The first battle had been won, but the war was far from over, and Eleanor was just getting started. The weeks following Gabriel's christening turned the Vance mansion into a psychological battlefield. Richard didn't leave the house as Eleanor had expected. Instead, he dug in, becoming increasingly erratic and desperate. Jessica also remained, but now the mask of the devoted friend had fallen away completely. The looks the two women exchanged in the hallways were charged with pure hatred. Eleanor remained calm, knowing that the pressure she was exerting on them would eventually break them. Without access to the family's money, Richard began selling off his own assets. His sports car disappeared from the garage, replaced by a more modest model. The designer clothes from Neiman Marcus stopped arriving in boxes for Jessica, small humiliations that ate away at the facade of glamour they both so carefully cultivated. One night, Eleanor overheard a particularly violent argument coming from the guest room where Jessica was staying. "This is your fault." Jessica's voice cut through the air like shattered glass. "You said she was weak, that it would be easy. Now look at us, with nothing." Richard's response was a low growl. "I didn't hear you complaining when you were spending the money I was borrowing from her. You're just as guilty as I am." The word borrowing drew a bitter laugh from Jessica. "Borrowing? You call what we plan to steal borrowing? How convenient to revise history now that we've been caught." Eleanor didn't stay to hear more. She had everything she needed. Their own words confirmed the conspiracy. What Eleanor didn't expect was that Richard's desperation would lead him to one last, desperate move. He hired lawyers, the best he could afford with what little he had left, and filed a lawsuit for custody of Gabriel. The claim was cruel in its simplicity. Eleanor, he alleged, suffered from severe mental instability resulting from the accident. She was a negligent and potentially dangerous mother. He presented bought and paid for testimony, forged medical reports, and even edited videos of Eleanor having the episodes she had deliberately staged weeks ago. When Mr. Sterling handed Eleanor the lawsuit notice, she turned pale. Not from fear, but from an anger so intense her vision momentarily blurred. Richard was trying to take her son from her. After everything he had done, all the lies, all the betrayal, he still thought he could hurt her in the worst possible way. Eleanor realized she had been too merciful. It was time to end this, once and for all. The trial was set for 2 weeks later. Mr. Sterling worked day and night preparing Eleanor's defense, but she had something far more powerful than legal arguments. She had the truth, documented in all its sordid detail. While Richard and his lawyers prepared their case, Eleanor was preparing something much bigger, a revelation that would not only destroy Richard's case, but Richard himself. Eleanor visited the secret apartment using the key Mrs. Peterson had given her. The place was exactly as she expected, a love nest decorated with expensive taste and maintained with money Richard had siphoned from their joint accounts. There were photographs of Richard and Jessica on every surface, undeniable evidence of a relationship that dated back long before the accident. Eleanor photographed everything, then hired a private investigator who obtained bank statements showing the regular payments Richard made for the apartment, to Jessica's account, for jewelry and trips. But the masterstroke came from a completely unexpected source. A nurse from Westwood General Hospital, who had been on duty the night of the accident, approached Eleanor 3 days before the trial. The woman was visibly nervous, wringing her hands as she spoke. "I shouldn't be doing this," the nurse said, "but I heard you screaming that night. I saw how you arrived here fighting for your life and your baby's life, and I heard what that man said when he thought no one was paying attention." The nurse handed Eleanor a recording. It was from the hospital hallway from the security system. On the recording, Richard could be heard talking to Jessica, both thinking they were alone. Richard's voice was clear. It was so close. If she hadn't managed to get out of the car on her own. Jessica's reply was equally callous. "Don't think about that now. She survived, but we can still use this. She's fragile. We'll make it look like the trauma made her unstable." Eleanor listened to the recording 3 times, each word stabbing her heart like a dagger. She thanked the nurse, compensating her generously for her courage in coming forward. Now she had not only evidence of financial conspiracy, but proof of their intent to exploit her, to destroy her from the moment of the accident. It was more than enough. The day of the trial arrived like an inevitable storm. The courtroom was packed, the media out, in full force. The case had captured the public's imagination. Billionaire heiress versus cheating husband fighting for custody of their child. It was the kind of drama that fueled headlines for weeks. Richard arrived with his lawyers, wearing an impeccable suit and carrying a briefcase full of lies. Jessica was with him, having been called as a witness for his defense. When Eleanor entered, a hush fell over the room. She wore a simple but elegant white suit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She did not look fragile or traumatized. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman in absolute control of her life and her destiny. Gabriel was with Mrs. Peterson in a separate room, shielded from the circus that was about to begin. Richard's lawyers went first, presenting their case with the pomp and confidence of those who believe they've won before the fight has even started. They showed the videos of Eleanor dropping things, crying for no reason, looking confused and disoriented. They called psychiatrists who, without ever having examined Eleanor personally, diagnosed her with a series of alarming conditions. It was an impressive performance of lies wrapped in medical and legal jargon. Jessica was called to the stand. She took the witness box in a demure dress and minimal makeup, clearly coached to appear serious and trustworthy. Under oath, she testified that Eleanor often seemed distant, that she struggled to care for Gabriel, that she expressed worrying thoughts about not being able to handle motherhood. Every word was a carefully constructed lie, but delivered with such conviction that several of the jurors looked genuinely concerned. When it was Mr. Sterling's turn, he began calmly, methodically. He dismantled each of Richard's witnesses, pointed out the inconsistencies in the forged medical reports, questioned the credentials of the psychiatrists who had never examined Eleanor. But Eleanor knew that rational arguments wouldn't be enough. Emotion, drama, revelation. That's what they needed. When Eleanor was called to testify, she walked to the stand with her head held high. Under Mr. Sterling's questioning, she told her story. Not the sanitized version Richard expected, but the full truth. The accident, the icy water, Richard choosing to save Jessica first. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Richard shot up from his chair, protesting loudly, but the judge ordered him to sit down. Eleanor continued, her voice never wavering. She described how she had feigned partial amnesia because she feared for her safety and that of her unborn child. How she had discovered the secret apartment, the embezzled funds, the plans to have her declared mentally incompetent. She presented every piece of evidence methodically, the photographs from the apartment, the bank statements, the text messages between Richard and Jessica dating back years. And then, for the final blow, she played the hospital recording. Richard's voice echoed through the silent courtroom. It was so close if she hadn't managed to get out of the car on her own. You could have heard a pin drop. All eyes were on Richard, who had turned a ghastly shade of grey. Jessica covered her face with her hands, knowing it was over. Richard's lawyer tried to recover, claiming the recording was taken out of context, that his words were misinterpreted. But it was too late. The jury had seen the truth, had heard it with their own ears. When Mr. Sterling called the nurse to authenticate the recording and Mrs. Peterson to testify about the secret apartment, Richard's case completely disintegrated. The verdict was unanimous and swift. Custody would remain solely with Eleanor. Richard would get only supervised visits if Eleanor allowed them. Furthermore, the judge ordered a full investigation into the embezzlement of funds and the forgery of documents. While it wasn't a court that could prosecute those aspects, the proper authorities would be notified. Eleanor left the courthouse with Gabriel in her arms, flashbulbs exploding around her. She gave no interviews, made no statements. She simply got into her car and went home. To her home. The mansion that was now truly hers, free from the toxic presence of Richard and Jessica. The following months brought dramatic changes. Richard was forced to leave the mansion, moving into a small apartment in Van Nuys that he could barely afford. Jessica disappeared from public life, the shame and scandal making it impossible to maintain her position in Los Angeles society. Rumor had it she had returned to her hometown in the Midwest, living with relatives and trying to rebuild a life away from the spotlight. Vance Industries flourished under Eleanor's renewed management. She discovered she had a natural talent for business, inherited from her father and grandfather, that had just needed to be unlocked. Under her leadership, the group expanded into new markets, established strategic partnerships, and increased its profits by 30% in the first year. The same partners who had looked at her with pity before now treated her with respect and even admiration. Gabriel grew up healthy and happy, surrounded by the love of a mother who had proven to be stronger than anyone could have imagined. He had the mansion, the gardens, and Mrs. Peterson, who doted on him constantly, but more importantly, he had Eleanor, who dedicated every day to ensuring he grew up knowing he was unconditionally loved. One morning, exactly 1 year after the trial, Eleanor was on the mansion's veranda, sipping coffee as she watched Gabriel take his first wobbly steps across the lawn. The morning sun lit up Santa Monica Bay in the distance, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of jasmine from the climbing vines. Mrs. Peterson brought the newspaper, and Eleanor saw her own picture on the cover of the business section. "Businesswoman of the Year," the headline read. Eleanor smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph over defeated enemies. It was a smile of genuine peace, of someone who had walked through fire and emerged not just intact, but forged into something stronger. She looked at the scars that still marked her hands, permanent reminders of that night in the water. Once, those marks had represented trauma and betrayal. Now they were symbols of survival and resilience. Richard tried to make contact a few times, pathetic messages begging for forgiveness, for a second chance, claiming he had been weak and had made mistakes. Eleanor never replied, not because she held a grudge, but because there was simply no more room in her life for him. She had moved on, and he was just a shadow in her past, powerless to ever hurt her again. Jessica, surprisingly, sent a letter. It wasn't an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement. She wrote that she had let herself be consumed by envy, by greed, by the desire for a life that wasn't hers, that she had paid the price for her choices and now had to live with the consequences. Eleanor read the letter once and then threw it away. Some bridges once burned don't need to be rebuilt. As Eleanor watched Gabriel laugh with pure joy while chasing a butterfly in the garden, she felt a deep gratitude for her strength, for the loyalty of people like Mrs. Peterson and Mr. Sterling, and even for the trauma that had transformed her. She had saved herself when no one else would. She had saved her son. She had saved her legacy. And in doing so, she had discovered who she truly was, not the spoiled heiress everyone thought they knew, but a woman of steel cloaked in silk, capable of anything to protect what she loved. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was a partnership proposal from an international firm, another opportunity to expand the Vance empire. Eleanor answered with her professional, confident voice, already thinking strategically about the next moves. Gabriel ran to her, hugging her leg and looking up with those big, trusting eyes. Eleanor ruffled the boy's hair affectionately while negotiating millions over the phone. This was her life now. Mother, CEO, survivor, warrior, and she wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. As the sun set that evening, painting the LA sky in shades of orange and pink, Eleanor was on the veranda again, Gabriel asleep in her arms. She looked back at the mansion gates that had witnessed so much pain and drama. Then she looked forward, to the endless horizon that represented her future, a future she would build with her own hands, on her own terms, free from the chains of the past. The storm had passed. Peace, at last, had arrived. And Eleanor Vance, the woman who had risen from the cold waters of that fateful night, was ready to embrace every moment to come.